A product of its times. Describing any book as a product of its times or any piece of art as a product of its times is about as useful as saying the sky is blue, and just as frequently inaccurate. If a book is said to be a product of its times, the critic explains away what is seen in modern times as the book's problematic elements. Fractured prose, perhaps, or something as serious as racist attitudes reflected in its pages. We do the art itself a disservice when we reduce its problematic elements to a product of its times, but we also do ourselves a disservice in the process. By attempting that kind of hand wave, we are dismissing the critical context in which the art must be understood, while at the same time pretending to acknowledge the same. T.S. Eliot has called The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn a masterpiece. Ernest Hemingway says Huckleberry Finn is the source of all modern American literature. Conversely, Louisa May Alcott, Twain's contemporary, called it inelegant and morally repugnant. 100 years later, Ralph Ellison joined the detractors, objecting to the characterization of the black characters, Jim in particular. Published in 1884, Huckleberry Finn is Mark Twain's successor to Tom Sawyer, published in 1876. Huckleberry Finn is one of the most famous American novels, of course, surpassing its predecessor not only in sales, but also in acclaim and contempt. It remains one of the most divisive novels in American literature. So let's talk about it. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn has been subjected to censorship and appeared on banned book lists since it was first published. Twain's classic novel has been attacked by critics and opponents largely on three fronts: the indelicate depiction of racial inequality, moral relativism, and its adherence to phonetic dialects. Strangely enough, Huckleberry Finn is lauded for these three things as much as it is decried. The two principal characters, Huckleberry Finn, a 14-year-old white vagabond runaway, and Jim, a runaway slave in Missouri, slave country, both seek freedom. Despite the divergence of Huck and Jim's individual definitions of freedom, Twain also converges and complements the two narratives. In doing so, Huckleberry Finn was among the first American novels suggesting a new model for interracial relationships. While The Adventures of Tom Sawyer was a children's adventure book written by an adult in the third-person narrator, Huckleberry Finn is an adult book written by an adolescent on the verge of adulthood in the first person. Huck tells his own story here. The reader is privy to nothing that Huck can't know. We hear Huck's own voice come through perfectly clear, along with the misspellings of a great many words. One of these words is civilization. This misspelling likely denotes the difference between two distinct realities: civilization and civilization. The former being the ideal community of rational human beings abiding in harmony and democracy, the latter being the world in which our prejudices taint all that could be good about humanity. Spelling civilization with an S is like, in our day, spelling society with a sus. At the end of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Huck came into a great deal of money, $6,000 in gold. This has bought him nothing but trouble, and a few chapters into the start of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, he's on the run from his evil, abusive pap who's slithered out from under his rock to collect on Huck's windfall. Huck fakes his death, joins up with Jim, and together they head south on a raft down the Mississippi River. Now, while they both seek freedom, the two characters couldn't be more different. Jim's voice and status in particular are marginalized. His agency is near zero. Huck has fairly few lines of dialogue and few people listen to him, but his agency is absolute. Huck and Jim's plan is to float south from St. Petersburg, Missouri to Cairo, and buy passage on a ferry up the Ohio River, likely all the way through Illinois to Indiana or beyond, although a destination is never mentioned. In those days, Illinois was a free state, but bounty hunters were allowed to operate in border states of slave states to capture and return runaway slaves. So if floating down the Mississippi River doesn't immediately seem to make a lot of sense at first, just know that for Jim, simply crossing the Mississippi River from the Missouri into Illinois would have been just as dangerous as staying in Missouri. At any rate, the plan fails when a mishap floats them past Cairo in the fog, and they miss their ferry north. Huck and Jim were powerless to turn back and had to carry on down the river, deeper into the south. Huck and Jim's initial tenuous bond strengthens during this period of the novel. They had an amiable relationship prior to the start of the book, but the close quarters of the raft and caring for one another on the run has endeared them to one another. Huck experiences an awakening of compassion for this man, a slave, something he's been taught isn't possible. He has many opportunities throughout the novel to betray Jim, but he takes considerable personal risk into himself to protect Jim and aid his escape at every turn. I will resist summarizing the entire novel here, but at one point, Huck reflects upon seeing a scene of mob justice that human beings can be awful cruel to one another. This is a poignant moment because the victims of the violence Huck witnesses are also the would-be perpetrators of a scam to disinherit 3 orphan girls of their entire estate and leave them penniless. It could be that Huck, in that moment of reflection, is seeing the cruelty on both sides of the issue, both in the crime and the punishment. But I think it's more likely that the visual impact of seeing 2 men tarred and feathered has elicited compassion in Huck rather than bloodlust, despite the fact that these 2 men were clearly wicked men. By the end of the novel, Huck and Jim find themselves momentarily separated, and Jim is sold off to a man named Silas Phelps, an opportunist who hopes to collect a bounty on Jim. When Huck walks up to the Phelps farm to investigate, here the book takes a turn for the patently silly, in that Sally Phelps, Silas's wife, mistakes Huckleberry Finn for her nephew who's come to visit. Huck plays along, but he's worried for a moment about what kind of character he's supposed to be playing. Who is this nephew? Until he learns that Sally's nephew's name is Tom Sawyer. Okay, so Huck plays off that he's old Tom and gets along great with Aunt Sally, and it's funny. But the real Tom Sawyer soon shows up, and the pair devise a plan to pretend that Tom is his brother Sid come to visit too, Sid not wanting to be left out of the summer fun. This reunion of Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer sets the stage for the conclusion of the novel in what is known as the evasion chapters. Huck and Tom endeavor to set Jim free from the Silas estate by means of the most elaborate and chivalric way imaginable. Huck suggests they simply cut Jim's bonds and turn him loose. But Tom is punch drunk on the high drama of adventure novels he's read, such as The Count of Monte Cristo, and this elaborately delays Jim's escape. However, Tom's ridiculous plans work for a time anyway, and Jim is set free, but not before the 3 draw an angry mob which chases them through the woods out to the river, shooting at them blindly. They make it to the river unseen, but Tom is shot in the leg and begins to go into shock. It's at this point Jim puts a stop to the entire escape and gives himself up in order that Tom can be treated by a doctor. By and by, Tom gets his doctor. Jim is put back in chains, and Huck is depressed. But then Tom reveals that Jim has been free all along, that Mrs. Watson, Jim's owner, died 2 months past and set Jim free in her will. So Jim is turned loose. And no matter how you cut it, this is an evil trick Tom has played, delaying Jim's release for weeks and endangering his life in the process, all for a bit of high-adventure play. With all the subtlety of a baseball bat to the face, we learn that Tom is still a boy, and that Huck is angry with Tom reveals that Huck's maturity has far outpaced Tom's and is well on the way to manhood. But then it's at this point Jim reveals a secret that he's been keeping. Huck's pap is dead, and it's safe for Huck to go home. But where Tom had kept his secret about Jim in order to have his fun, Jim kept his secret about pap to keep Huck always on the run. Never really certain if Huck would have stuck with him if Huck's freedom came before Jim's. Huck chooses not to go back to St. Petersburg, Missouri, at least not to stay. He never explains why, but it's certainly because of the wicked game Tom Sawyer made of freeing Jim from captivity by elaborate escape plans for his own amusement, all the while knowing that Jim was free and this was too much for Huck to forgive. That perhaps Tom wasn't too much different from the rest of the civilized world, and not even his own best friend was good enough society for Huck. Many readers interpret Huckleberry Finn as a romantic rejection of civilization in favor of a natural life, Living on one's own terms, indefinitely, living apart from society, another one of America's great dreams. But this isn't so. Huck craves society. He adapts to life under the Widow Douglas, even though she makes him wear shoes and go to church and go to school. He follows the formal rules of the Phelpses at the end of the novel when he lives with them. Huck repeatedly laments that he feels lonesome when he's left on his own. He sticks with Jim not only because they're good to each other and for each other, but because Jim is good society for Huck. In the end, Huck lights out for the territories and presumably composes the book we just read. Okay, so then to wrap up the summary section of this video, if you want a nice, neat list of themes, here they are. Now, Huck, the narrator, has composed this novel the way he and his countrymen speak. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is singularly the most phonetic book I've ever read, maybe with the exception of Cloud Atlas. In doing this, Mark Twain, the author, exquisitely brings to bear 19th century Mississippi River vernacular. But the device that works to greatest effect in this novel is the shift away from the third-person narrator of the boy's adventure in Tom Sawyer and allowing Huck to tell his own story. In Mark Twain, Racial Politics in Huckleberry Finn, Peter Messent says, "In having Huck tell his own story, he overturned all the novelistic conventions of his time concerning the use of formal or standard English and set the American novel on a new course." First person being inherently a limited perspective, coupled with Huck's semi-educated diction, offers us a lot of laughs. Yet, while Huckleberry Finn functions as a comedy, that's not what's really important here. The laughs are like oars in our hand to help us navigate the rough waters, the towheads, and dark themes hidden in the river ahead. But as a humorist, Twain detracts obvious attention away from the immediate issues of society while at the same time responding to them. That's the genius here. Messent goes on to say, freedom signifies differently for Huck than it does for Jim. On the raft, Huck speaks as one who is free and easy and comfortable, words shot through with a specific set of meanings, the product of his situation now in comparison to his former one. So here we have Huckleberry Finn, a realist literary hero, a 14-year-old vagabond, perceptive and canny for his age, quick to perceive but slow to comprehend. As readers, however, we are not slow to comprehend. Our ability to see through Huck's uncertainties and narrative biases is strictly due to there being two authors of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Huck's first-person narrative and Twain from a distance. While each author are realists, they tell us different things. Author Huck presents a world that vexes and baffles him. Author Twain presents a world we understand all too well. Twain puts the world on trial, and we are the jury. Huck presents the world that must simply be inhabited for lack of options, a world within which he must simply survive. And while Huck shares his feelings, Twain lays out the facts. Huck does not worry himself with correcting his broken colloquial vernacular for his debut publication. Nor does he shy away from relating the unvarnished truth about his reactions to the events of the novel. Now, the character and the author, Huckleberry Finn, is not well read and only passably literate, yet he spins a tremendous yarn. Storytelling and English composition are different skills, yet without the benefit of author Twain's erudite understanding of pacing, plotting, theme, the morality tale, author Huck poorly executes these devices in his book. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is a ranging, episodic narrative. The novel is full of vaguely fulfilled plot lines, some rambling on for a whole chapter before we learn that it's just misdirection. Yet throughout all the chapters, we see a growing morality forming in the background, and Huckleberry Finn, whether he's aware of it as the author or not, is absolutely including his new awakening. But in the author's note, author Twain famously warns us away from identifying morals. It says, "Notice, persons attempting to find a motive in this narrative will be prosecuted. Persons attempting to find a moral in it will be banished. Persons attempting to find a plot will be shot by order of the author." Yet, if we grant that author Huck is attempting to find a motive in his own moral narrative, It is also fair to grant that his insight quickly gives way to emotion, oftentimes to shame. We know that Huck's accommodations for Jim and evasions of civilization are to become far more serious when he lights out for the territories in the end. Will Huck compromise his morality to conform with civilization, or will he evade civilization for all time and outcast all his days? These are the implicit questions posed by author Huck and answers refused by author Twain. Huckleberry Finn as a character is one of our earliest American heroes, the cloth from which the self-guided outcast archetype is cut. Huck Finn is often compared to Oliver Twist. Both youths appear in downtrodden, sentimental stories, but for me, there the comparison ends. While I love Dickens's Twist, it is quite a different creation from Twain's Finn. Oliver Twist is a victim of his society, and a lens through which we observe the hypocrisy of the Industrial Revolution era in London. Finn is a free-thinking self-exile, a lens through which we observe the ugly truths of the antebellum South. Yet both works are replete with satire, incisive wit, and microscopic observations. Now, this is a huge stretch of what I'm about to say, and I'm probably going to lose some of you here. I think Huckleberry Finn is actually more similar to Marvel's Drax the Destroyer. Drax is funny precisely because he doesn't see the humor in what he's doing. He doesn't see the humor in what others are doing. Huckleberry Finn is exactly the same. He is observant and compassionate, but not very imaginative, and doesn't joke around and cut up like his pal Tom Sawyer does. When Huck concludes that doing the right thing will eventually land him in hell, he does so without the slightest sense of irony. There's a moment on shore when Jim tells Huck that bees do not sting idiots. But Huck doesn't believe Jim because he's never been stung, and he doesn't realize that Jim is teasing him. Drax the Destroyer is based on Huckleberry Finn. However, Huck's oblivious nature extends only so far. Huck is worldly wise. He sees through fraudsters' machinations. He knows Tom ain't right in the head and heart, and he recognizes futility when he sees it. Yet, despite his bleak observations of the world, Huck is not yet jaded. Huck is a unique narrator in that he endeavors to relate his observations honestly. Huck grew up as unmoored from society as one can be, yet he's not totally free from its influence. And while it's clear Huck's worldview was clearly formed by everyone around him, at once his pap, the Calvinist biblical literalist Miss Watson, the widow Douglas, and even from Jim, it's clear that Huck has a good heart and a strong mind that leads him in the end to a worldview of his own construction. It was, in fact, Huck's unmoored life which allowed him the mental space to allow his moral courage to come to the fore in order that he might not only defend Jim, but to love him. In her 1996 introduction to the Oxford University Press edition of Huckleberry Finn, Toni Morrison notes that Huck is beset with terror, melancholy, and suicidal thoughts. Huck seeks his freedom from his pap on the river, but Morrison posits the question, what does he need in order to be free from terror, melancholy, and suicidal thoughts? The answer, of course, is Jim. Huck is interminably lonesome, a word he often repeats. But as soon as he's partnered up with Jim, the lonesomeness he sees in the world is outside of himself. He watches the lonesomeness of the river hour after hour as they drift along. Morrison suggests, as others have, that Huck and Jim's bond goes deeper than friendship, but that Jim becomes a surrogate father to Huck, hidden beneath a veneer of racial tropes to ease, or to more likely to dupe, a racist readership of the day. At its core, Huck Finn is about discovering morality. Huck's morality comes not from the widow Douglas, it comes not from Pap, it's not his Sunday schools, it doesn't come from any of the authority figures Huck encounters throughout the novel. The heart of Huck's morality is not even his own twisted-up conscience. In the end, Huckleberry Finn's seat of morality is his compassionate, freedom-seeking heart. Yet, whence flows this compassion? Mark Twain said, all moral perceptions are acquired by the influences around us. These influences begin in infancy. We never get a chance to find out whether we have any that are innate or not. Twain was a proponent of the writings of Thomas Paine and Oliver Wendell Holmes, particularly their arguments for rationalism. These early arguments paired well with utilitarian ethics. Twain further aligned himself with W.E.H. Lecky's History of European Morals, which says, "A desire to obtain happiness and to avoid pain is the only possible motive to action. The reason and the only reason why we should perform virtuous actions, or in other words, seek the good of others, is that on the whole, such a course will bring us the greatest amount of happiness." Now, Twain crosses out the word should and noted in the margins of his book, "Leave the should out, then it's perfect and true." All Huck's life, he's been taught that some men are the rightful property of others, and it's a righteous imperative to return that property when it wanders off. So the right thing to do is to turn Jim in. But his conscience just goes for him. It doesn't sit right. He doesn't like it. He revolts against what the civilized world tells him is the right thing and ends up doing the wrong thing because all his life he's been the outcast, and why stop now? His moral compass is made up of selfish, mediated feelings which leads to the choices that only satisfies his own happiness. His moral compass, he concludes, is leading him on the path to hell, and he's committed to it. This willful endangerment of his soul is the ultimate act of love. And as we see that Pap Finn in the civilized world's pro-slavery imperative doesn't stick with Huck, it tugs on him as a source of shame, even as Huck discovers compassion for Jim. Now, as compassion and empathy for Jim awakens within Huck, he's pulled in opposite directions. Do what the church and society have always taught him is correct, that he must turn Jim over to his owners and end this lawless bid for freedom, or to follow his own evil heart by supporting Jim and his quest. One night, Huck reflects, "It don't make no sense whether you do right or wrong. A person's conscience ain't got no sense, and just goes for him anyway. If I had a yaller dog that didn't know no more than a person's conscience does, I would poison him." Throughout the novel, we see Huck respond to his own imperatives. He tries to save a murderous crew of rapscallions on a sinking ferry. He saves the orphan girls from having their inheritance stolen away by grifters. And he never betrays Jim, even when he has 1,000 chances to do so. His knowledge of right and wrong didn't tell him to do these things. His moral map was drawn by society. It was his own heart's compass showing him how to be happy, how to maximize comfort and minimize discomfort. So if you're seeing a distinct lack of divinely inspired morality here, you've struck on Twain's most cogent, understated, secular point. Greg Campfield writes, "As much as the novel is about an individual's moral development, it is a novel about training human compassion in society. And while Huck may serve his own feelings in his moral decisions, they grow risky to him. He satisfies his heart in defiance of merely utilitarian calculations of self-interest. In spite of his intention to argue that morality is really selfishness, Twain moves to a middle ground position. He was concerned with the basis of morality because he was concerned about the relationship between moral intentions and consequences. Sentimentalists emphasized intention, while utilitarians stressed consequences." The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is a 14-year-old boy's transition into a man's understanding of the world. Huck lets go of civilization's expectations and decides for himself where he stands. What's more adult than learning that you possess the ability to decide what's right? George Washington Cable was a Confederate soldier turned writer who, during the Reconstruction, observed that the racial hierarchy of the South was intrinsically wrong. He wrote a number of essays denouncing Jim Crow and advocating for racial equality, even writing novels depicting mixed-race families. A Southerner publicly denouncing the South as racist earned him nothing but enmity and was forced to move north to Massachusetts to avoid hostilities against him. The people who most needed to hear his message had turned against him because of his direct methods. Twain met Cable in New Orleans in 1882 after the publication of Tom Sawyer and while he was writing Huckleberry Finn. Twain learned from Cable the conditions of blacks in the Deep South. He also learned the dangers of addressing the problem of race directly. Twain decided that his character Jim would undergo greater hardships the closer he became to becoming free, finally suffering the worst captivity of his life after he's technically been granted his freedom. The evasion chapters of Huckleberry Finn are an allegory promoting racial equality during the period in time where conditions were worse for the enslaved people of America. Cantfield writes, but Twain was not willing to risk his livelihood on the cause, so he hid his message behind slapstick humor, which was the point of the book's illustrations. While Twain expressed displeasure that the caricatures made the characters into grotesques, he accepted them. These comic illustrations provide a countertext to all levels of satire, but most especially, the illustrations soften the satire against racial bigotry. Twain was well aware he was writing satire on racial bigotry, and in order to be effective, he chose to use the language of racial bigotry. Huckleberry Finn is without peers among major Euro-American novels for its explicitly anti-racist stance. Those who brand the book racist generally do so without having considered the specific form of racial discourse to which the novel responds. Furthermore, Huckleberry Finn offers much more than the typical liberal defenses of human dignity and protests against cruelty. Though it contains some such elements, it is more fundamentally a critique of those fictions, most notably Romanticism, religion, and the concept of the Negro, which serve to justify and disguise selfish, cruel, and exploitive behavior. Twain's use of the N-word has provoked some readers to reject the novel. A careful assessment of this term within the context of American racial discourse, however, will allow us to understand the particular way in which the author uses it, most obviously as a synonym for slave. There is ample evidence from other sources that this corresponds to one usage common during the antebellum period. Both Huck and Jim use the word in this sense. Twain recognizes this invidious tendency of race thinking, however, and takes every opportunity to expose the mismatch between the racial abstractions and real human beings. A reader who objects to the N-word might still insist that Twain could have avoided using it. But it is difficult to imagine how Twain could have debunked a discourse without using the specific terms of that discourse. Even when Twain was writing his book, the slur was universally recognized as insulting, a demeaning word. The objections had been common for half a century before Huckleberry Finn was published. The specific function of this term in this book, however, is neither to offend nor merely to provide linguistic authenticity. Much more importantly, it establishes a context against which Jim's specific virtues may emerge as explicit refutations of racist presuppositions. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was banned just 2 years after it was published in 1884, but not for the same reasons it gets banned today. In the late 19th century, readers were outraged at the premise of a white boy befriending a black man and campaigning for his freedom. Nobody cared about the language used in the telling of the tale, except that it was too colloquial and crude for literary critics at the time. Huck Finn remains controversial today, but the concerns have drifted to the slur employed throughout. Mark Twain is known for his mastery of language and diction, and Twain tells us, in this book a number of dialects are used, to wit, the Missouri Negro dialect, the extremist form of the backwoods Southwestern dialect, the ordinary Pike County dialect, and the modified varieties of the last. The shadings of these have not been done in a haphazard fashion or by guesswork, but painstakingly and with the trustworthy guidance and support of personal familiarity with these several forms of speech. I make this explanation for the reason that without it, many readers would suppose that all these characters were trying to talk alike and not succeeding. In the foreword to the Penguin edition of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Azar Nafisi says, "Those who hate The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn are disturbed by its heresies, and those who love it are not immune either, or insensitive to the time image in the mirror that the book relentlessly, if compassionately, reflects." Toni Morrison, reflecting on her reading of Huckleberry Finn while under the instruction of an English teacher in junior high school and finding it alarming, said the efforts of removing the book from schools were based, it seems to me, on a narrow notion of how to handle the offense Mark Twain's use of the N-word would occasion for black students and the corrosive effect it would have on white ones. It struck me as a purist yet elementary kind of censorship designed to appease adults rather than to educate children. Amputate the problem, band-aid the solution. A serious, comprehensive discussion of the term by an intelligent teacher would have spared us all some grief. The brilliance of Huckleberry Finn is that it is the argument it raises. And on a personal note, I want to say that when I first read Huckleberry Finn in school, mine was an all-white classroom, and I lived in an all-white small town in Iowa. I don't remember a lot of racism in my school, and since we were all white Christian kids, we found other reasons to hate each other, like which church you went to, or whether you lived in town or on a farm, or if daddy bought you a car, or if you had to work jobs to afford one. Humans have always drawn lines and hated the other side. As for the subject of slavery, when we read Huckleberry Finn, this was an unreal concept whose consequences applied to none of us in any real way. Of course, we knew what it was, and in those days, schools still taught that the Civil War was fought primarily to end slavery. All of us kids had seen the movie Glory, and we'd loved it and learned from it. Yet, Huckleberry Finn was taught to us purely as an adventure book. No breakdown, no parsing its complex themes. We read the redacted version of the story where the N-word was replaced with slave, and yet we never talked about slavery, except that perhaps it was the reason Jim was on the run, carrying equal weight to Huck going on the run to get away from his dad. So in eliminating the offending N-word from the classroom environment, we also threw out the need to address the most difficult elements of the book entirely. Peter Messent, the author of the Cambridge Introduction to Mark Twain, argues that perhaps Huck Finn is not a book for younger readers. Perhaps it is a book best read at higher levels where it can be put in its larger discursive context, explain how the irony works, and the enormous harm that racist language can do. After all, you're not likely to encounter Solomon Northup, Harriet Beecher Stowe, or Frederick Douglass in high school classrooms either. Huck Finn's association with its little brother book Tom Sawyer makes it easily mistaken for a children's adventure when it most certainly is not. Twain himself said Huckleberry Finn is not a book for boys, but for those who used to be boys. Louisa May Alcott, author of Little Women, was among Huckleberry Finn's detractors, considering the book inelegant and morally repugnant. Inelegant? Perhaps on a sentence-by-sentence level if you're a proscriptive linguist absolutist, but descriptive linguists delight in the variety of vernacular, the historical tracing of expressions that would have been lost if Twain stuck to prescribed and inaccurate dialogue for his characters. But morally repugnant? I can't imagine Alcott objected to Finn's refusal to betray a runaway slave. Alcott's own father was an abolitionist on the Underground Railroad. And Alcott wasn't formal with religion either, tending toward transcendentalism and Unitarianism. So her moral objections likely weren't in regards to Huck's resolution to follow his conscience to hell. Louisa May Alcott held the English language so sacrosanct that to distort it with vernacular was the real moral outrage. Now, a more sophisticated objection to Huck Finn was shared by the African-American novelist and literary critic Ralph Ellison. Ellison based his critique of the novel, which he said certainly upsets a Negro reader, not on the N-word, but on the blackface minstrel show comic conventions of the day that Mark Twain frequently employed, at times reducing Jim to caricature and relegating him back into the Reconstructionist tradition that dictated, in Ellison's words, that Negro males must be treated either as boys or uncles, never as men. So what is Huckleberry Finn if not a boys' adventure novel? Is it so inappropriate for children or even teens that it can only be taught in higher education? Is it a racist book, or is it an anti-racist book? Is it unreadable trash, or is it the great American novel? I would love it if you would weigh in on this downstairs in the comments. Let me know where you stand on Huckleberry Finn. I think you know, of course, where I stand on this after watching this entire video. And even those who would agree with me sometimes argue that a careless reading of Huckleberry Finn could lead to exacerbated racist attitudes. They argue that the book's deeper meanings are too deeply woven into the story to be deciphered by the average reader. And indeed, I'm 45 years old, and I'm just now coming to this deep of an appreciation of Huckleberry Finn. The first time I read it, absolutely not. But I don't think that when I was a teenager and I read this book in high school, even with a sort of inept teacher, I don't think it came along with bad ideas, perhaps not all of the right ideas, but I don't think I came away with the wrong ideas. But there may be something to that argument that in order to fully appreciate and deeply understand Huckleberry Finn, you have to be somebody like Toni Morrison, somebody whose thought processes and understanding of literature are so much deeper than the average person. Do you have to be Harold Bloom or Toni Morrison or whoever to fully appreciate Huckleberry Finn? Is it too obscure? There might be something to that argument. I'm going to close here with 3 quotes, one from Toni Morrison, one from Greg Campfield, and one from Ralph Ellison. Toni Morrison says, "The source of my unease reading this amazing, troubling book now seems clear. An imperfect coming to terms with 3 matters Twain addresses: Huck Finn's estrangement, soulness and his morbidity as an outcast child, the disproportionate sadness at the center of Jim's and his relationship, and the secrecy in which Huck's engagement with other than escape from a racist society is necessarily conducted. It is also clear that the rewards of my effort to come to terms have been abundant." In his Oxford Companion to Mark Twain, Greg Campfield says, "Whatever the reasons that drive quite diverse people to want to exile Huck, the fundamental cause, it seems to me, is fear of his immediate honesty, which leads to this impatience and hypocrisy and pretense, and that leads to his irreverent independence of all pressures to conform. And many people of all backgrounds are deeply suspicious of incorrigible nonconformists. While nonconformists make some of us acutely uncomfortable, no civilization that cares about freedom can afford not to have them. We cannot afford to banish Huck." And I'll close in the words of Ralph Ellison from his introduction to The Invisible Man. "If the ideal of achieving a true political equality eludes us in reality, as it continues to do, there is still available that fictional vision of an ideal democracy in which the actual combines with the ideal, and gives us representations of a state of things in which the highly placed and lowly, the black and the white, the northerner and the southerner, the native-born and the immigrant, are combined to tell us of transcendent truths and possibilities such as those discovered when Mark Twain set Huck and Jim afloat on the raft." Thank you for watching. I have been Eric Gronsky. This has been a video on Huckleberry Finn, and until next time, read something good.